What's up, guys? I just wanted to make a quick video for you guys that are having carburetor issues with these Chinese mini excavators or anything really. Let's be honest, the main problem, people pick them up from these auction sites or wherever they get them and they say it won't start, or it'll only run with the choke on, or I've got fuel coming out of my exhaust, which is a bad one, and I'll explain why that happens here in a second. Or it'll idle but it won't rev up. I mean, there's all kinds of issues that the carburetor can cause, and people are all pissed off because they bought this brand new machine but it won't run right, or it won't start, or it won't idle. I'll show you why that is happening. This particular carburetor is not off of one of those mini excavators or any of that kind of stuff. This is actually off a little Honda Z50R motorcycle, I believe. I've got a few of them here, but they're all the same concept, and this is set up kind of like the ones on the Chinese mini excavators, but I don't feel like pulling mine off because it's all set up and runs great and everything, and if I've already fixed everything on it, I don't want to pull it off just to make a video. So we'll just go in a line here. Say you have your fuel tank full of fuel. Your carburetor sets on your machine. The fuel inlet on this one is going to be right here, which on most other carburetors is going to be hanging off the side. It's usually brass like this, but that's where the fuel comes out of the fuel tank and enters into the carburetor, comes down into the float bowl. This is your float bowl. So here it would be on your machine. You have your float bowl here. I've noticed a lot of times when I tell somebody they need to go through the carburetor, they need to clean the carburetor. What they do is they pull this float bowl off and they clean this out, and they still have the same issue. That's not cleaning a carburetor. Yes, you do not want a bunch of crap in here, but that's not what cleaning a carburetor is. So if you take your float bowl off, like I told you, the fuel from the fuel tank comes in through the inlet valve here. But the guys that are having issues where they have fuel actually dripping out of their exhaust, this is why this is happening. This brass seat right here, that is the needle seat. On some carburetors, the cheaper ones, that can just be a hole that's in the actual body casting, the carburetor body casting. Not all of them are brass, but most of them are brass. This is the float needle. This is what everybody has that issue. I tell them you need to fix this issue. They have a rubber tip. All this is a tapered hole that the float needle goes into and seals off the fuel when the float bowl is full. How does it do that? This is the float. I mean, it's not set up exactly like all of them, but it's the same concept. The needle slides into the float. It has a push pin on top that sets down in there, and then there'll be a pin that goes through on this one that you tighten up with this Phillips screw here and holds it all together. When this is all together, it looks something like this. So you have your float bowl, the fuel is coming in, filling up the float bowl, and this float right here, when the level of the fuel rises in the bowl, it will come up and it will push against that needle and shut the fuel inlet off to where it will not allow more fuel in. What's happening with these guys that the exhaust or the engine's flooding, crankcase is full of fuel, whatever, it is because this is leaking. Whether there's dirt down there in the seat keeping the needle from sealing tightly, or the rubber's deformed, or there's all kinds of problems that can happen. But you want to take that out, clean that up. I usually will get a little bit of Scotch-Brite and roll it up in a, I don't know what you call it, just roll it up a little bit, stick it in there and give it some spins, spray it out with carburetor cleaner. You'll be able to get it nice and clean. And then check the tip of the needle valve itself. Make sure it's not deformed. Make sure the rubber's in good condition so that it can seal at the bottom of that seat. That will take care of the engine flooding issue. It'll also keep you from having to replace your engine oil because it's full of gas, ruin the seals in the crankcase, the bearings, all that stuff. Now we'll move on from that. I'll explain why that's happening actually. When the float doesn't close and it fills this up with fuel, the float bowl, it has nowhere else to go but run up into your main jet or whatever orifice is easily accessible, honestly. And then it will run into the venturi of your carburetor and this will be connected to the intake on your engine, and it'll actually run through there, drip down through the intake valve, and that's where it's leaking around the piston rings and stuff and seeping into your crankcase. And then if your piston rings are sealing, you know, it'll actually run out of your exhaust valve down into the exhaust, and that's why you're getting fuel coming out of your exhaust. And then obviously when you crank the engine over with that fuel in the cylinder, it can either hydrolock or push it out the exhaust or blow it back through the intake. That's why when you get a camshaft with a rounded cam lobe, it will actually, a lot of times you can tell by when your engine's running or when it's when you're trying to start it, you'll actually see fuel, vaporized fuel blowing back through the air box, because that valve is not, it's either staying open or it's not closing all the way, and it's blowing that back through there. Now that you know how the float needle and the bowl work, also I'll just explain this. This is not on the specific machine that I'm talking about, the Chinese mini excavators. The float bowl on those is sealed. There's no overflow, so that's why the fuel has nowhere else to go but straight into the intake, into the engine. This is just an overflow tower here. It has a hole in it. When the fuel level gets too high, it will be able to run past and drain out of this hose onto your pretty driveway or your pretty grass. Also, you can drain it by just taking this out, you know, let the fuel come out there. But that's what that's there for. Not all carburetors have them, and that's why it runs into the intake. Now that we know how all that works, let's move on to the guys that are going to pick them up. And first we'll do a no start condition. A no start condition either means, if it's a fuel related one, which is that's what this is 90% of the time, it is because the jets, each one of these holes, let's see, yeah, I still have one for this carburetor. This one has a main jet that sits in there like this. You screw it into there. There's a very small hole in there. I don't know if this camera will focus to where you can see it or not. Very small orifice in there. And when that's in there and your engine is running, it is using vacuum to pull the fuel through this jet, vaporize it, and then go into the engine. If this jet is even remotely plugged, that small hole, if it has the smallest piece of sand, usually fuel will varnish and or close the hole or completely close it. And that's what causes a lot of these issues. I'll explain a little bit of that in a minute. But if there's also a slow jet, and I'm not going to be able to show you on the carburetor that is on the Chinese mini excavator. It is actually a plastic piece that sets out here under the low speed idle screw. You'll be able to see that the low speed idle screw goes in and it holds the plastic piece in. That jet, the slow jet, is in that on the Chinese mini excavator. I'll talk about that after I get done with this. But when the fuel gets pulled through here, like I said, if it's closed, plugged up in any way, it will not allow fuel to come up through the main jet and into the venturi, so you are getting no fuel into your intake. Therefore, yeah, it's not going to start. Usually a no start will be, the main jet has a bigger hole than the slow jet does, so usually the main jet doesn't get clogged, but it can if it's setting, you know, if it's setting with fuel in it for a long time or something, or a big piece of dirt gets through the filter, something like that. The main issue is going to be that slow jet that is a little plastic piece that's pushed in using the O-ring on the Chinese mini excavator. Let's see if I have a pilot jet in here. I don't see one in here, but oh, this one actually doesn't use a pilot jet. It's a fixed tube for a pilot jet, but usually they'll unscrew out of there, and it has its own size orifice too. Usually the slow jet will control anything at an idle and just a little bit above. So on the pilot jet or slow jet, that's going to control anything. If you have your throttle right here and you have your throttle down at the turtle at an idle, that's going to be your slow jet. This is where it is on this carburetor. We'll just use this for now. Like I said, on the Chinese mini excavator, it's actually a plastic one out here on the side that pushes into the carburetor body, and you can pull it out and see the brass piece in there. But that's what controls the fuel mixture at an idle or just a little bit above idle. So carburetor sitting here, fuel's in here, and it's idling, it's going to be pulling that fuel through the pilot jet. That has a very, very, very small hole in it, and is a lot more susceptible to small pieces of dirt or varnished fuel plugging that jet. So that's going to cause a no start issue. If it's partially plugged, it could possibly run, but idle rough, it will be lean. And literally all you have to do to fix that is take the plastic piece out that has the brass jet in it on the other carburetor. On this one it would be this, but it doesn't even have a removable jet. You would take that out, you can spray, hold it up to a light source and you can see the hole. You'll be able to see if it's plugged or partially plugged. Spray some contact cleaner into it. You can actually pull a strand of wire. You can just pull one strand out of it, run it through there because it will not damage the jet. And you can unplug that hole with it and then spray it out again, compressed air. Also, that slow jet circuit on this carburetor, on all the carburetors, but it's not the exact same as this one. You can see once it goes through that jet, it goes into this little valley here, which then goes to your mixture screw. The mixture screw, let's see if I got one out in here. I don't think so. The mixture screw is just a taper-headed screw, basically. The more you screw it in, it will plug the hole. The more you back it off, it'll unplug the hole, let more fuel through. So, with that being said, there is another area right in here that is susceptible to dirt, varnished fuel stuff, plugging that up. So take the mixture screw out, do the same thing you did with the jet, blow carburetor cleaner, compressed air, whatever, through here, unplug that, put your mixture screw back in, and then your idle slow jet circuit will be good to go. Obviously you're going to want to adjust this after you start the engine, have it running, get it warm, but I'll talk about that later too. Going back to the main jet, the other issue. If you have a machine that will idle, it seems to idle okay, it seems to start okay, but as soon as you try to give it throttle, it tries to die or surge and it just won't rev up. That's because when you open the throttle and get more vacuum coming through here, it starts pulling the extra needed fuel from the main jet, which have the bigger orifice there. Remember I told you it doesn't plug near as easily, but that doesn't mean that things, particles, stuff in the fuel bowl can't get sucked in that and plug. If you're above 8th throttle, like you barely move it, you're moving to the main jet. That's going to provide all the extra fuel needed for the engine to increase RPM. So we'll be pulling that fuel through this jet, vaporizing, coming in, mixing with the air. That's why it will not rev up if you have that issue. As far as the mixture screw, I believe on the Chinese mini excavator it does not have a spring. Most of them have a spring on the inside of here, and that just creates tension against the threads to keep it from vibrating out. If I remember right, the one on the Chinese mini excavator does not have that, so it will vibrate loose and stuff. You could put something on there to kind of, I wouldn't put Loctite on it, but you could do something to keep it from vibrating. In a general rule of thumb, one turn out is where most of them will run okay. So after you clean everything, put the carburetor back on, you can back this out one turn, meaning turn it all the way in clockwise till it seats. Do not crank on it, just barely seat it. Then back it out one turn. After you start your machine up, let it idle a little bit, warm up to normal operating temperature, bring it all the way down to an idle, and that's what this will help control. A lot of guys will, this is the idle screw here. It actually moves the slide up and down. In the other carburetors, it will open the butterfly a little bit, but it's the same thing. In is going to make your idle go faster because that tapered screw pushes on it. Backing it out will bring the idle down. A lot of guys, when the pilot jet is clogged, they'll say, well, my idle is low, that's why I won't idle, and they'll crank on this idle screw. That turns that idle screw in and opens up the butterfly, and that throws everything out of whack. Do not do that. Because when you do that, what it is actually doing is starting to pull fuel from the main jet because you're bringing the idle up. That's going to make your idle circuit obsolete. It's going to make it idle fast. It's going to make it terrible. Just don't do that. what you want to do is leave the idle where it is. If you took that out and have to reset it, just barely open up your butterfly with it to get a base setting. Put it on the machine. If it's idling way up, obviously back it out, bring it down to a nice smooth idle, and then move to your mixture screw. While the machine's running, you can slowly back it out counterclockwise, and if it starts idling smoother or gets a higher idle, then keep going until it starts to stumble. But you do not want to go more than, I would say, 2.5 turns out. Usually at 3 turns out, they're so loose that they'll just vibrate out and stuff. And what that means is that you need a bigger pilot jet, because you're backing this out, allowing more fuel, and it's still not enough. The mixture's still so lean that it is not, you don't have enough within this parameter. So you would need to put a bigger pilot jet in, which is what most machines need, one size bigger, and that will give you more fuel. Then you can bring this turn into, say, probably 3/4 of a turnout and have a nice, clean, smooth idle. Also, before I end this, the guys are saying it will only run with the choke on. I figured I'd go over that too. So when your pilot jet is clogged and you turn your choke on, what you're doing is closing off the airflow inside the venturi, so your air filter, the outside air, is allowing less in, and that's why your machine will run with a little bit of fuel that's still getting through, good enough to idle. But once you shut that choke off and it starts letting the correct amount of air in, you're not then getting the correct amount of fuel because your pilot jet is partially clogged. I hope that makes sense. Basically, all this entire thing is doing is metering the correct amount of air and the correct amount of fuel for the machine to run properly. It's all metering. So if you put the choke on, cutting off air, allowing not really more fuel, but you're running off more fuel that's available, whatever can get through here, with less air coming in. So if your machine is running properly, you will have no choke. You'll be getting the correct amount of fuel through the slow jet to run in an idle and to help with, I mean, that's what makes your machine start and idle. If this is not clear, you're going to have issues starting and idling. That meters the correct amount of fuel through here for your low speeds. And then if you throttle up, then the correct amount of fuel and air is going to be metered by the fuel coming in through the main jet and the air being sucked in from the air filter, the outside clean. Anyways, sorry for the quick, kind of out of sorts video, but in the wrong carburetor, but hopefully that gives you guys an idea of what's going on and why I say don't just buy a replacement Amazon carburetor. This, I'm going to be honest, this is an Amazon carburetor. I think this is the original. Yes, you can see right here it has the K. It's a key and carb that came on the Honda Z50, sorry. But this one I had to replace because either that or I think in the bowl actually the tower was broke off because somebody put the bowl on in a bind and broke it off, and then it just allowed fuel to drain out. So we replaced that. It was cheap. Got this Amazon carburetor. The reason I say don't replace with Amazon carburetors just to say you clean your carb is because everything we just talked about with the float valve, this piece and the needle that seats in there, if you're having an issue where your float valve is leaking, say your engine's flooded, you have the typical fuel coming out of the exhaust, fuel in the oil in the crankcase, and you just take off your old carburetor and bolt on this Amazon carburetor. You're like, all right, there, clean carb, it's brand new. And then you hook it up, guess what? You have the same exact issue. The reason for that is you're unplugging the fuel line off the old carburetor, putting a new one in, plugging the fuel line on. Any of that dirt and sediment and bad fuel that's in the bottom of the fuel tank is going in right onto that float valve and putting dirt right back where we don't want it, and it's allowing it to overflow again and go into your intake. That's why I say don't just swap out carburetors with a cheap Amazon carburetor. The Amazon carburetors, I don't put on anything unless it's like a cheap mower or something that you don't want to spend a lot of money on. It's not that they're terrible carburetors, it's that they do not come set up already. They come together, but just the issue, like I said with that, a lot of times the float will be sticky. The jets aren't always the same size jets as you had in your original carburetor. So if you're just bolting one on that has bigger jets, you're going to run super rich and be flooding again. or you're gonna be running super lean if it has smaller jets. That's why I don't recommend just bolting on a new Amazon carburetor. Fine, if you want to have a backup, get it, go through it, open up all those things, clean out your fuel tank so you know when you put it on, it's not going to just destroy the float valve immediately. But yeah, that's my opinion on that. And you can see what happens inside of a carburetor when it sets for a little while. All this corrosion, and most of the time it'll have a dark film of varnish, and that's the stuff that you want to clean out of there, because that's what gets into your jet and plugs it up. But hopefully that quick video helps you guys understand that a little better, because I feel like a lot of you guys are buying these things and you're like, I bought a brand new machine and it doesn't start. Well, a lot of times the reason for that is because these things come in from overseas, and even here in the USA. They have fuel put in them when they're on the lot, the sales lot, the auction lot, dealerships. I used to clean a carburetor on every machine before we even put it out the door if it had fuel in it, because once you put fuel in it, if it's sitting on the floor, it only takes like 5 days or something like that for fuel to start varnishing. So say you fill that machine up, you put it on the sales floor, it sits there for, most of them sit there for months. So that fuel's sitting in it and it's in the carburetor, and it's just gonna varnish and clog up all that stuff, get filthy, get the float valve sticky, stuff like that. Then you sell it to somebody, it either won't run, or it runs like shit, or it leaks fuel. That's why. So the auction lots that these mini excavators come from, or from overseas, if they go ahead and put a battery fuel in it to move it around the lot or whatever, then they sit on the lot. That's why that's happening, because they're not using them. They're supposed to have zero or low hours on them, you know, when you get them. So they just sit there with fuel. That's why that's happening. You need to, I would recommend, as soon as you buy one, just pull the carburetor off of it, go through it, check your engine oil, make sure it's not full of fuel from the float valve leaking, stuff like that, to prevent some huge failures down the road. And I just realized that I failed to mention, if you do have a leaking float valve and you have fuel coming out of your exhaust, stuff like that, that means it is in the crankcase mixed with oil. Do not run it like that. Do not do anything else. Stop it, drain the oil, get all that out of there, shut the fuel off. That's going to ruin a bunch of stuff, and it's a huge fire hazard. If you're seeing a lot of smoking, smelling raw fuel coming through the exhaust, smells rich, shut it down, fix it. I actually just wanted to show you guys this on the mini excavator on the carburetor that I was speaking about. This plastic piece right here is what I was talking about, that is pressed into the carburetor. There's an O-ring on the bottom, but your slow jet is inside of that. So if you're having an issue where it will not idle, or it's hard starting but it will rev up, then that means that your main jet is getting fuel through it. It's not starting or idling because this jet is plugged up. And if you were in a hurry at the sales lot or whatever, you could take the throttle stop screw out, pull this out of there and clean that jet out, put it back in, then it will start and idle. I wouldn't recommend doing that. I'd recommend cleaning the entire carburetor, but if you just need to get by, get it to start, you could do that. Looking at this here, I mentioned that the mixture screw, it is right there, and you can see that this one is actually leaking a little bit. It's kind of a shitty setup on this one. Like I said, it doesn't use a spring, so it doesn't have tension, and it's kind of a loose fit. Not a real big fan of that. I'll see if I can come up with a fix for that.